to Bit by Bit, Broadway's only podcast dedicated to the producer-investor relationship. I'm your host, Megan Ann Rasmussen, and today we're taking a deep dive into Spells of the Sea. One of my goals with this podcast is to encourage emerging producers and first-time investors. And at the conclusion of this, our first full podcast season, I wanted to share how I'm using the advice from Broadway's Bit by Bit podcast guests to inform my work. After all, isn't that how we learn and grow, is by learning best practices and then putting that wisdom to work. So before we get started, first some shout outs. I am grateful to each and every listener. This is a new endeavor for me. It's so exciting. I was once getting certified. Some of you may know that I've taught on the university level for a number of years. I've taught at 3 different universities, and I was getting certified to be like an online teacher. And I remember like the first module or course, and we had to record like a lesson. And I was like, oh, I like this. Like, I'm good at this. I think I'm good at this. This is going to be great. So when the podcast technology developed such that could help me with my technology challenged ways, I was like, I'm in. And then, of course, I had to partner with the fabulous William Kauser. And Will is the magic behind all of this. He is the Oz. He's the real deal. He is the engineer, producer of Broadway's Bit by Bit. And I'm so grateful because without Will, we would not be having this podcast. So shout and props to Will Kauser. I've had a number of people ask me who I'm using, and they're starting to use him, which is fabulous for him. And I wish him all the best as both a theater producer and director, and also a film director. So good things ahead, Will. Thanks for being a part of this. A couple more shout outs. I am grateful for those who have specifically commented, shared, reviewed, and encouraged this podcast. So those shout outs include Michelle Kaplan, Emily Jepson, Deanna Knutson, John Corbin Goldsberry, and Ken Davenport, all of whom have made specific comments about this podcast in an effort to help share it. And I really appreciate that. If you want me to shout out your name, please leave me a comment or review, share the podcast, and I would love to be able to shout you out as well, because this is a community. And I feel strongly about that. I've been engaged in this work for 3 years, and I'm leveraging 25 years in the theater world to create this podcast. And it's all about giving back and what I've learned, and also helping to connect the dots in so many different ways. So if you've listened to this podcast for 10 episodes, it's been interviews, which are terrific. And I learned so much from each one of the guests, all with the end goal to help share the knowledge with emerging producers and first-time investors. But at the end of the season, I wanted to reflect back on the comprehensive through lines from these different guests in this period of time, and also forward cast into how I'm using what we were learning in a practical sense. Many of you know I'm lead producer on a show called Spells of the Sea. Very excited about this show. And we've just finished our first enhanced out-of-town production, and I'll break out those terms as we get going. But it's a significant part of this show's journey, and it's a great time to take a time out, reflect on what we've learned so that I can share, but also internally so I can refine my processes and do better moving forward. So I'm going to screen share for those of you that are listening to this. I will talk through some of the photos. If you want to see this on YouTube, our Bit by Bit YouTube channel, you can see some of the images. I hope it will be an exciting exploration. If it is, let me know. If it's not, I also want to know so that I can best serve you, this audience. This is the deep dive into Spells of the Sea, utilizing the practical application from this season, our first season of Broadway's Bit by Bit podcast, Broadway's only podcast focused on the producer-investor relationship. Spells of the Sea is an enchanting new musical, and I'm going to start with one of the reviews, one of our very first reviews. This comes from Mariah Richardson, and I was in the house opening night when Mariah was there, and I was thrilled to see what she wrote about it afterwards. She wrote, "Spellbound by Spells of the Sea. Quote, a work of pure joy. It will have you rising and falling like the sea with all the emotion it invokes. Then she wrote, the best show Metro has ever done. And I had to pause there because Mariah is also a playwright and she's done a show at Metro. So what a compliment. Mariah, if you are listening, please know that we take your trust in this show seriously and are grateful for your encouragement. She also said, it's a story for all ages. Everyone should grab their kids and grandparents and spouses and loved ones and go see this play. Thank you again, Mariah L. Richardson. I love starting with the reviews because this process of creating a new theatrical production is such a marathon. And sometimes you need a little carrot at the end, or you need to see the light at the end of the tunnel to know that you can get where you need to get going. So what better way than to start with a review? Forwardcasting to the end of this experience so that you know that we had a good go of it. I want to start with a little bit of a short background on me. And if you can see my screen, you would see images of various education and professional endeavors I've been involved with. But if you don't know, in short, for those who don't know me, from my early days in kindergarten and likely before, I have been involved in theater. I think my family still scratches their head about how that came to be, but there it is. And none of my family is involved in theater. I get that question a lot. I'm a daughter of an attorney and an English teacher. And as the oldest of 8 children, I will say that we naturally have a lot of storylines in our household. And as families go, we have plenty of theater and drama in our day-to-day lives. But in short, I am a California-raised Bostonian, now living in Utah. I have 2 degrees in theater, a BFA in acting from Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts, and a master's degree from Brigham Young in Provo, Utah. Early in my career, I had work opportunities at Walt Disney World, Sundance Film Festival, and the Kennedy Center. I started my own theater company, the Firehouse Theater, in Kaysville, Utah. And I have taught at 3 universities throughout Utah and was served as president of TYA USA. Very proud of those opportunities and the work I was able to help build and grow with colleagues across the country. I've attended 5 triennial international conferences, so conferences that happen every 3 years in different parts of the world. And those include Korea, Montreal, Australia, Copenhagen, Malmo, and there is a 5th one that I will have to think about and post about. But yes, I'm very grateful for those experiences to engage with colleagues across the world. That's a little short background about me. And then how did I come to producing? A key part of my story is my pandemic pivot. And while I was attending a virtual national conference, I found on the same platform I was streaming that conference, a podcast by Ken Davenport. Ken Davenport is a 2-time Tony Award-winning Broadway producer. And oh, the irony that I first met Ken on a podcast. And here we are today in the same format. There was something about the way Ken was talking to his guests and the way that he was deep diving into conversations that I thought were so interesting. If you get the opportunity, if you haven't already, I encourage you to check out Ken Davenport's podcast. He has, I think it's like 500 episodes. I mean, it's really an incredible amount of work. I joined Ken's Theater Maker Studio. I became a private coaching client, an investor, a co-producer, a founding member of his Next Stage program, and a founding member of his Elite program. Ken continues to be a mentor and a coach, a friend and a colleague. I feel so grateful that I was able to work with Ken when Broadway was closed for 18 months during the pandemic. And so I had great opportunity to work with him and gain great insights. And then as the Broadway came back, it was, again, a great education to watch him produce and bring to the stage 4 different productions in 1 year. That was really just a very unique opportunity, and that has formed my experience. Ken has been very kind to me in his words. I'm going to share this with you. Less self-gratification and more like appreciation for mentors in our life. And that's something that I've found as I've interviewed podcast guests of the importance of the community that we build. Ken has said of my work, Megan Ann is a welcome addition to the Broadway industry. She has both strong creative instincts and a business mind that I have no doubt will lead her to terrific success. She is a true entrepreneur. That's why when looking for co-producers for one of my shows, I wanted her. And Ken, if you're listening, I just wanted to say thank you for your instruction and friendship this far in my career. It has really been formative. Because of my involvement with Ken and the Davenport Theatrical Group, I was able to be an investor in A Beautiful Noise, the Neil Diamond musical, which opened this past fall and is now playing on Broadway. Get your tickets. Also, Harmony, music by Barry Manilow with a book and lyrics by Bruce Sussman. And that was directed by Warren Carlyle, starring Sierra Boggess and Chip Zien. And I saw that show when it first opened, and it's been fun to watch that journey. Also, I have a small part in the Griswolds Broadway Vacation, and am a co-producer of Joy on Broadway, which is a new musical headed to Broadway, and have had the privilege to watch that from very early stages of development. Okay. That brings us to a tradition of family theater on Broadway. If you were watching my screen, you would see some playbills of lots of different shows ranging from Frog and Toad to The Very Hungry Caterpillar, Patterton to Freckle-Faced Strawberry, Berenstain Bears, Sesame Street, Winnie the Pooh, Junie B. Jones, and Pinkalicious. And what I love is that there is a tradition of Broadway shows for families. And Spells of the Sea, remember this is a deep dive into Spells of the Sea, is also a celebration of youth and the power of theater to inspire children and adults alike. And while these shows are specifically built for Broadway and are based on familiar children's literature, I also want to mention that the theater that crosses all age delineations. And I'm talking about shows like The Lion King, Shrek, Elf, Matilda, and Seussical. These shows have a timelessness and an agelessness to them. In their core, there is a sophistication of story that plays to audience members both young and young at heart. And I'm especially intrigued by these shows and seek to create work with equal transcendence. And I hope that Spells of the Sea can be a show like that. How did I come to interact with Spells of the Sea? This segment is about Spells of the Sea and me. I will say that all of the 3 projects I have lead produced have come from relationships. They've all come about in different ways. One project I was asked to direct, and then I wanted to produce it. With Heaven Come Home, I met an artist, Justin Payne, and I knew I wanted to work with him. And that's how I came to be a lead producer on Heaven Come Home. And with Spells of the Sea, I had a longtime colleague who shared a script with me, and that's Dr. Megan Allretz, who teaches at the University of Texas, Austin. And Megan Ann, we have go way back. And I was working on bringing another exciting piece for families to Off-Broadway. And because of some scheduling challenges and some other specifics, that project didn't come to fruition. And my colleague, Dr. Megan Allretz, knew I was looking for a piece to take to New York. And because we have worked together for so long, she suggested this piece, Spells of the Sea. And I remember where I was the first time I heard it, and I knew there was something special, something unique about it. And so that's how Spells of the Sea and me came to be. As I reflect on how we create work, I just want to call out Mark Rubinski, one of our guests on the podcast. And he has such a genuine way of engaging with investors and in different projects. And I hope that I can use his sense of genuineness to lean into when I do any project. I just feel like that there's so much power and importance to just being who you are and leaning into that, and then finding those people who are attracted to the same things you are and building those relationships. Let's transition to the development history of this piece, Spells of the Sea. I was really inspired by Alex Timber's candid deep dive on Instagram into the behind the scenes backstory of Beetlejuice. He started writing that December 23rd of 2022. And he says, quote, in the lead up to Beetlejuice's closing on Broadway, I'm going to be sharing some of my favorite memories, starting at the very beginning with development readings, workshops, choreography labs, wigs, and makeup tests. And he goes on to share a number of reflections through January 11th. And that last post talks about the final bows of that Beetlejuice team. And there was just something so potent about being candid and sharing the journey, the experience from his perspective. I was really inspired by that. So in a similar vein, it's part of my mission to share what I am learning in real time. I have been surprised at the number of requests I've received from emerging producers that they have approached me interested in working with me to learn the business of producing. And while I've only been focused on the specific Broadway producing journey for 3 years, I hope to bring to these conversations nearly 23 years I've spent working in theater. Also, I hope to bring my passion for producing and the end goal to create work that uplifts and strengthens, because I believe theater changes lives. It strengthens families, because the intergenerational experience of taking our families to the theater builds individuals and families. It builds communities and our society. So to those producers and to every producer, this podcast is for you. And I hope you'll find it helpful. If you do, like I said, let me know. And if you don't, I'd like to know that too. Okay, development history. So the piece started with, as written in Gwenny Goveria's West Campus apartment. She actually started writing it during the pandemic at her home and then moved back to campus and started writing there. And she started with one song, and that song led to another song, which led to a show. And then she reached out to the Cohen's Newark Festival. And while theaters were still closed, she talked with this entity about making Spells of the Sea a podcast. And boy, if you haven't heard it yet, I encourage you to do it. You can find it on Spotify, Spells of the Sea. And it is terrific. It's fully produced. And that's when Gwenny engaged her roommate and now best friend, Anna Pickett, to direct the podcast. And Anna was able to create this incredible website, spellsofthesea.com, which includes activities for families and young people. It was something active for people to do during quarantine. The first podcast episode opened the Cohen's Newark Festival April 12th, 2021. And like I said, that's still available on Spotify. This sidebar is a shout out to one of my podcast guests this season, Allison Hernandez. And she talked about the tenacity of doing all the things.
The biggest realization for me, 2 days after the concert, not even the day of the concert, was that producing is not for the faint of heart. And there are so many more details that you just can't even anticipate.
If you know Allison, she has a history of working in human resources, and she knows a lot of what it takes to put things together. And even still, putting together a show in any of its stages requires a lot. So I wanted to shout out that in the development of Spells of the Sea, it takes a lot to put it together. I joined with Gwenny in July of 2021. Shortly thereafter, we had conversations about optioning Spells of the Sea for commercial production. After that, I engaged a dramaturg that helped with some early script writing. For those of you who know Eric Webb, a shout out to Eric Webb. He's terrific. He helped give us lay a really strong foundation for where the show has come from. In October of 2021, the Spells of the Sea podcast was nominated for 12 awards for the B. Iden Payne Awards. And that's a program now in its 49th year that celebrates excellence in the arts in Austin, Texas. And we were thrilled that Spells of the Sea won Outstanding Original Script for that award. And it was just an early indication of what we all knew, that this was a special piece and that it was going to have a long life. And thanks to my colleague, Megan Allretz, Spells of the Sea and myself, Megan and Rasmussen Productions, we were connected with Metro Theater Company. Thanks to Megan's work with the artistic director there, Julia Flood, who I knew in many capacities on the TYA USA board. I think I was rotating off as president as Julia was coming on. But we share a cadre of comrades and colleagues, have both worked in the field for many years. And I was thrilled that Metro Theater Company, in its celebration of its 50th anniversary, was interested in bringing Spells of the Sea to the stage. I really appreciated that they were honoring their roots, which was actually in circus. And so they have a production coming up soon called Go Dog Go, which is under the big top. So in one hand, they were honoring their roots, and then the other hand, they were looking forward to new voices and the future of theater. And that's where Spells of the Sea came in. Spells of the Sea is written by Gwenny Govea, with creative contributions by Anna Pickett. And it really is two young people with a strong aesthetic sharing their perspective on the world. And there, I can't think of anything else, anything more worthy of celebrating than that. Metro announced in May of 2022 that they were going to host the world premiere of Spells of the Sea as part of their 50th anniversary. And this is where I cut in another review of the show. This is from Broadway World. They say of Spells of the Sea, a lively adventure, a lovely show, right up there with Metro Theater Company's best. And again, we're talking 50 years, right? 50 years of creating theater, and to have that kind of experience is really terrific. Thank you, Metro. Thank you, Broadway World. When I talked with Eric Imani, and he was my very first interview on the podcast, he inspired me to find investors that I really connected with. Even more so, I felt like Eric really inspired me to tap into the work that I felt was most important and to always honor that.
You know, I'm always attracted to the story that moves me in my seat.
And that was my experience with Spells of the Sea. So to Eric's credit, we leaned into those moments and those works, those pieces that move me in my seat. In June of 2022, Spells of the Sea was selected from one of 900. It was selected as one of only 4 plays and for a 10-day development workshop at the Pegasus Play Lab, which is sponsored by the University of Central Florida. There were over 900 applications. We were thrilled. And we joined with over 30 professionals, artists, educators, and graduate students from the University of Central Florida, including the University of Central Florida and the University of Texas, Austin, which all came together to workshop this piece. That was quite an experience. I remember the first day, all the seats and the tables that were set up, and the idea that we would take this script from the page to the stage, and we would have this formative experience of what it would look like. And we were so grateful to have Julia Flood helm that experience. There were a lot of people in the room, a lot of things happening at the same time: dramaturgy, music development, design development. Also, I worked with 2 producing interns to get their perspective and to help shape the piece. And it really was a terrific experience. I'm grateful to Pegasus Play Lab. And if you have the opportunity to work with the folks down at the University of Central Florida, I highly encourage you to do that in their Pegasus Play Lab. That was our first real step in taking it from the page through the podcast to the stage. Now, I'm going to share with you a number from the show. And I have to set the stage. So we were on the brink of casting the show for a Metro Theater Company production. And I knew that Gwenny was interested in playing the lead role, Finley. She had written that role. And I was only hesitant because I knew we needed her on the other side of the table to help with the writing. But I have to laugh that the very first time I heard Gwenny perform for a live audience was at a gala event in front of hundreds of people. She had just written the song at the Pegasus Play Lab literally days before. I mean, we had to work to get the music transposed so that we could have an accompanist in St. Louis be able to play it. But I had never heard her sing before. And so I'm going to play for you Gwenny singing her newly written Good at Something from Spells of the Sea.
caught one that was fast, I feel speedy quick. Have I done something? Is this now my shtick? This feels so strange, so familiar. It feels like home. Feels like something I'm good at. And Pa feels like something he'd smile at. Just catching, it's oh so easy. Feels like I might be good at something.
What I love about that clip is just seeing Gwenny be so confident. It was such a wonderful surprise. And of course, Gwenny was awesome. She sang beautifully. She held the audience and she connected with the material. After she closed, I knew we had our Finley. It was just a fun example of how the journey goes from casting and expectations and how people engage with the material at different points. That was a really big moment for us because we were, the gala was for Metro Theater Company and this was their audience base and a lot of the members of their board. And I was grateful that they could hear something that we would be doing in this next season and get excited about it, which they did. It was terrific. I'll talk a little bit about the development history and our Metro Theater Company workshop. So July through September, after our Pegasus Play Lab, Gwenny and Anna work with Dr. Megan Alretz as a dramaturg on rewrites from Pegasus Play Lab. And I think that, you know, when we talk about a show going to Broadway and how it takes 3 to 8 years to get that, that's really so true. And if one of my advices to emerging producers is remember you're in it for the long haul. This is definitely a marathon. And I always joke that I'm really good at sprints, but I've had to learn to stretch those legs, to use the metaphor. This is a marathon that we're in it for a long time. And sometimes I think like at different mile markers, like there's different sprints within them, but really it's keeping the pace and seeing the project through and encouraging the team all along the way. In October of 2022, Spells of the Sea had a workshop at Metro Theater Company. I was happy to help produce that in partnership with Metro Theater Company. And then in the fall of 2022, after that workshop, Gwenny and Anna worked again with Dr. Megan Alretz and director Julia Flood on some rewrites to get us ready for the first production. There's a wonderful sense for those of you who've been at this stage of sitting around the table and hearing something read, not just for the sake of development, but knowing that it's going into production. There's an energy, there's an enthusiasm, there's people already investing their time and their heart and their desire to make work that really resonates with folks. It made me think of Ananth, who I also had on the podcast. He has such a passion for work and finding shows that inspire him. I think of also Miranda Go. She is so passionate about celebrating new voices. And I channel both of them in this stage of the development when we were getting into it. We're getting into the words and the scripts and the music. And there was a moment where we had, even in this workshop, been giving Gwenny and Anna a lot of notes on things that we needed to change. And I just thought, we have so much that we've offered them. How is this going to work? And we had a reading at the last day of the workshop. And I was blown away at Gwenny and Anna's ability to incorporate notes so comprehensively through the entire rewrite. It was incredible. And that was one of the moments where I knew, okay, we can do this, because it takes so much more than just a great story. You also have to have team members that are engaged and willing to work hard and put in the time. I see that. It makes me think of a conversation we had with Janice Chan, who's a designer that we had on the podcast. And she just talked about choosing to work with people that you want to work with. And I've never felt that more so than with Spells of the Sea and making the conscious choice to be involved in a really long process with people and being grateful for the people who are dedicated to seeing it through. More reviews. This is from Two on the Aisle. The show is Metro's first project with a commercial producing partner, Megan Ann Rasmussen Productions. The benefit of this collaboration are easy to see in the splendid technical work. The production was designed to go places, and it most likely will. I love that quote because the entire community really rallied around this idea of this is a show for Metro plus, and where is it going to go next? It's a great deal of responsibility and also excitement as we look at how we can share this story with even more audiences. Two on the Aisle continues, quote, "The ear-catching songs are performed admirably under the music direction of Deborah Wixler-Puma." And then they talked about Tyler White, who played our mermaid, but also was our choreographer. White also supplied the enlivening choreography. The top-notch supporting cast displayed its versatility in multiple roles. And then they said, the centerpiece of Metro Theater Company's 50th season is the world premiere of Spells of the Sea, a delightful new musical for young audiences. Thank you to On the Aisles. I would encourage emerging producers and also investors to find mile markers along the journey. Find ways to check in and make sure that what you're involved with is something that you want to be involved with, that maybe you want to be involved with even more so. I want to take a moment to talk about what this relationship with Metro Theater Company was. This was an enhanced out-of-town tryout. That's what I like to call it. What is an enhancement? That's where I work as a producer to offer support to this production specifically. And while the details of the budget are privy just confidentially for myself and Metro Theater Company. But generally speaking, as an example of what those enhancement dollars went to, Metro usually does shows that have 3 to 4 different actors. This one, we ended up with 9. It was going to be 4 to 5 actors and then like 3 to 4 musicians. And it ended up being 9 actor musicians. So that was double the size of what Metro usually does. And so I was grateful to offer some enhancement in terms of being able to provide a larger cast, which meant, of course, more costumes. And given the nature of this piece, we thought there would be more props. So there was line items dedicated to that. And then also, Metro Theater, to their credit, cast from their talent pool in the St. Louis area. And we knew that we wanted to bring in Gwenny as Finley. So there was some travel and housing that was required. And then we also knew that Crank, the character of Crank, was a really important character. And we wanted to find the right fit. And we did find someone in St. Louis. Unfortunately, that person had surgery scheduled for the middle of the run. And so we knew that wasn't going to be a possibility. So we cast the net wider, and our valiant director and artistic director, Julia Flood, reached out to a colleague in Arizona, Child's Play, and they had an actor they thought would be perfect for the role. And so we brought in John Gentry. He actually came for the workshop, and we were able to hear him work and hear him sing. We felt like he would be the perfect fit. So some of the enhancement fund was to provide housing and the per diem, the transportation for 3 out-of-town artists, because we also brought in Anna Pickett as well. So it gives you a sense of what the enhancement is like. Of course, that arrangement was all created through an agreement that Michael Cinder, my attorney, helped create. And if you haven't heard the podcast by Michael Cinder, I really encourage you to go back and listen to it. He's such a master of the details, and he has comprehensive knowledge of Broadway, of all of his different experiences, including the Broadway League. And he brought to this out-of-town enhancement like a clear perspective of what I needed to do and what I could expect as a producer, for which I'm very grateful. I want to talk a bit about front money or early money investments. So as a producer, unless you are self-funding it, you have the opportunity and the responsibility to engage investors. And the front money or the early money is some of the most difficult to raise because, well, frankly, the risk is so high. It's just a concept. It's an idea. Sometimes it hasn't been fully fleshed out. It surely hasn't had a proven concept yet. So those investors that you engage with for this early front money, I think, are some of the most important investors. And this makes me think about my conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Nielsen. And she talked about what it was like for her to be an investor in a new show. And the gratification, I'm kind of forward casting a little bit, the gratification of seeing a show that she had invested in. And she said,
but going out to see the show that I had invested in had a totally different meaning. It deepened the experience, not just for the show that I invested in, but for all the other shows that we went to see.
But I really think the episode with Elizabeth Nielsen talks about the importance of the investor-producer relationship. So much of this is based on trust. trust. And developing that relationship is so key. Dr. Elizabeth Nielsen talks about her experience seeing the show that she invested in. And I am learning that there's so much to this journey of creating a show. And it's no wonder to me now that it takes 3 to 8 years to get a show to Broadway. And most take longer. There's so much to the development of a piece. So if you're a first-time investor and listening in, I encourage you to become familiar with the producer you are working with. In my best investor relationships, we communicate frequently. We email, we text, we exchange greeting cards, we meet in person. This is a real relationship. It's built on genuineness, like Mark Rubinski talked about, where we want to support each other. Those are so key, especially in the first relationships that you develop. I want to talk about the raise. This is such a big part of being a producer. If people say to me, well, I want to be a producer, but I don't really want to raise any money, I think, well, then you need to find another job, because this is the job. The job is to raise money. Somebody said to me, I'm so sorry you work in an industry where you have to raise money. And I was like, why? It's so exciting. I love being able to connect investors with projects that they're excited about, that they want to see develop, that they want to be a part of the process. It's a wonderful invitation to be a part of this world we love, which is creating theater. I will tell you that I talk to everyone. I talk to family. I talk to friends. I talk to their friends, everyone that I thought could be or might be interested in it. A key element to the raise is believing in it, believing in the show. And I had to really articulate what were the 10 reasons that I believe in Spells of the Sea. Why is this work important? And I had to dig deep to know what those were, because I wanted to be able to invite other people to participate. I also put together a pitch deck, which I thought was it's a key tool. And also this pitch deck was really well received. I had someone say that it was better than some of the Broadway produced pitch decks that they had seen, which was very kind. Since doing the Spells of the Sea pitch decks, I have received other materials from other producers for other shows. The other elements to those that I think are interesting are rehearsal footage, if the piece is still in development. I've seen some incredible trailers, as you may have seen, coming out for new Broadway musicals. So all of these important documents come into play. Also, at this early stage of the game, we may not have a detailed budget, but I wanted to make sure that we had some numbers that were helpful. So we would include, or at least in the conversation, what I thought it would take. We would talk about what's unique about this project, and then, of course, the risk. And that's so much a part of the entrepreneur mindset. I'm going to go back to Allison Hernandez, and she talks about in her episode on the podcast, being the entrepreneur. And we had dialogue where, that means sometimes not knowing how it's going to play out, but trusting that it will, and putting one foot in front of the other. And that's really so much of what this is. I'm specifically want to talk about Club 23. And this was an initiative that I created because we needed to create it. I reached out to, we had a deadline coming up at the end of the year, and you'll learn as you emerging producers get into this field even more so and ask more, needing to raise more money and make more asks, that there is a timeliness to when are good times to ask and less good times to ask. Right around tax season that we're coming into is not necessarily the best time, but right after is a better time. But always keeping the interested parties engaged and informed is really helpful. Christmas was the season that I was working into, and I knew we needed $23,000. And I looked at the calendar and thought, okay, how can we make this fun? How do we gamify this? So I was looking for 23 people to invest by the 23rd of December to reach $23,000. And this is a really helpful tip about why the people you surround yourself with and your coaches and your mentors and your colleagues are so important. So I actually took this to Ken in our mastermind group, and I said, hey, I have this great idea. I want to get 1,000 people to invest $23. That's a low number. surely somebody could that's what you would pay to take 2 people to lunch. Like we can do 1,000 people to donate $23. And in full transparency, I was only like a couple weeks out from this goal. And I just remember Ken being very cool, calm, and collective. And he's like, that's a lot of people. 1,000 people is a lot of people. He said, instead, would you consider finding 23 people who could give you $1,000? And that was such a paradigm shift for me. And I was like, I could do that. I could do that. And so then launched in the middle of Christmas, this whole initiative, this campaign to find 23 people who could give us $1,000 by the 23rd of December. And I call this Club 23. And that was because I grew up 15 minutes from Disneyland. I know that explains a lot, but in Disneyland, they have this Club 33, which is this exclusive, somewhat like mysterious Club 33 above Pirates of the Caribbean in like the New Orleans area. And it just always had like some mystique about it, but also was like really cool. And so I named this the Club 23 based off of Club 33 in Disneyland. I want you to know that I talk to even more people about this. I send it out with my Christmas card and I text people. And for everyone who's raising, you'll know that you take any amount that people are willing to give. So thankfully, there were a number of people who were able to give $1,000. I talked to one donor and she said, I looked at, it was very helpful that you called out what you needed. You needed 1,000 people to give $23. No, say that wrong. You needed 23 people to give $1,000. And I asked myself, could I be one of those 23? So it resonated with folks. We had people that weren't able to give 1,000, but could give 500 or could give 100 or could give 50 or 25. And all of those dollars added up. And even more important than the dollars, which were very important, was also the investment, the commitment that people made in me and made in the show. It was hoisting up a flag to say, this is something I'm passionate about and I'm doing. Will you support? And I was so inspired, motivated, buoyed up by the people who were like, yeah, I'll support you. We also ended up having, and I want to make a really important distinction. Metro Theater Company is a 501c not-for-profit. So because of that not-for-profit status, they were able to receive a donation, a tax-deductible donation. And this is very different than an investor in a commercial production. I can't stress this enough. And if you have any questions, you want to email me about this, I'm happy to talk about it. But there are very specific Securities and Exchange Commission laws about investments. You have to be an accredited investor, which means you have to either have $1 million of net worth or make $200,000 2 years in the past 2 years, or $300,000 combined income in the past 2 years. So it's and you have to self-certify that you are an accredited investor. It's very important. And that's really because of the risk that's involved in investing in Broadway. It's 1 in 5 Broadway musicals recoup, which I always like to say 1 in 10 tech startups recoup. So it's about risk and evaluating that risk. For our first-time investors, maybe that's information that's helpful to you. But I knew that because of the not-for-profit status, there were people who could give directly to Metro that would help our enhancement deal without investing as an accredited investor in Spells of the Sea, the commercial production. So it was a very unique situation. Why do I say this? Why do I share? Why do I take this time to spell out the details? In part because when you're working on a project, I encourage folks to lean into the strengths of the project. What are the assets? You've heard of a SWOT analysis, a strength, weakness, opportunity, threats. Like, what are your opportunities? What are your assets? And for me, I recognize that working with Metro Theater Company as a not-for-profit was a huge asset for so many different reasons, but in part because they were not-for-profit. So I had reached out to some people about investing in Spells of the Sea, and they would rather make a donation. I have 2 in particular. One was a very large amount that was able to make a donation because of the not-for-profit status, but knew that that would also help me as we work together in this enhancement. So that's a little bit about the raise and about the early parts of fundraising for the piece that you're passionate about, you're excited about. I love hearing the stories of how other people raise money. This is what our course was for this show. It could be different with others. If you have tips that you want to share, I would love to hear those, because it's all about working together to make it happen. If you are watching this, you can see on my screen some pictures from early rehearsals. I love seeing these rehearsals. I actually just did a presentation at the university I used to teach at, and I showed the pictures of the rehearsal photos and then the same images for the production photos. It's just really fun to see like how they parallel and the magic that happens in the rehearsal room to create a piece that will come on stage with all the elements. There's really nothing like it. I'm so grateful to be engaged in this work. Couple more reviews. This is from Pop Life's STL, which is St. Louis. They said of Spells of the Sea, it's an engaging cast and relatable story comes alive with the joyful music in the world premiere of Spells of the Sea. With equal parts whimsy, wonder, and wisdom, Spells of the Sea has good intentions and a compassionate message. The Odyssey comes with honest lessons on family, friendship, and belief in yourself. Trust your abilities. It's just the right, sincere message straight from the heart. This review from Pop Life STL goes on to say, Gouveia is a fresh voice to get to know. The impressive design team has created an enchanting world. The cast is a tight-knit, well-rehearsed, enthusiastic group conveying an earnest story that they believe in and work well together on stage. With their pure voices and pleasant harmonies, they easily connect with children in the audience. And then finally, Pop Life STL says, Spells of the Sea captivates in an authentic way, aided by an intriguing aspect of nature and enduring relationships in our life journey that teach us guiding principles. You know, I know we'll get to this, and maybe this is the transition point, but there is nothing like the experience of an opening night performance. Before we get to that, I want to talk about the public relations marketing part of this. What I hope I'm drawing out for friends that are listening is this production timeline. Where are you in your project along this timeline? What can you learn from this experience? How are you doing things differently? It's all involved and so detailed. I think about my conversation with Jason Turchin about how we are looking to the next generation and how they engage with entertainment and what we can learn from them. I think a big part of that comes in how we are marketing and our public relation efforts. I cannot say enough good things about Metro Theater Company. They are a mighty force. They have been doing this for 50 years. They have great relationships in the community. We had coverage on television. We had coverage on podcast. We had coverage in print, on blogs, in newspapers. They did such an incredible effort. And I want to specifically call out Sarah Thompson and her ability to engage with partners in sharing what was going to be a first ever production of Spells of the Sea. It's really hard to ask people to engage with something that's not a known title. I know that going into that. Not only that, but an emerging producer and an unknown playwright. Like that's a triple threat in a unique kind of way. And yet the community really was responsive and helping to share our story. It reminded me of a conversation we had with Ananth, who also, in addition to being a Broadway producer, does Broadway's Boxed Up, created Broadway's Boxed Up. And I really respect his way of looking at new ways to share Broadway and Broadway stories with others. I mean, his Broadway Boxed Up reaches like the far ends of the world. And I really think as we head into not just a generation, but like a season of Broadway, we have to look at how we are talking about our shows. I saw the trailer for New York, New York, and also for Parade. And I was so inspired with the way that they're communicating the essence of the show. We can all take a note on how to share our shows in such ways. We had some publicity photos for Spells of the Sea at the aquarium in St. Louis. We've had some great partners with the Missouri History Museum and also the aquarium. It was the first look at the show beyond just title art. It was really important. Cynthia Nordstrom, our Broadway-based costume designer, was a part of the process to help give everyone a flavor for what they could expect. She did a fantastic job. Nothing can quite prepare you for opening night. I don't know. This was my first opening night for something like this, so connected to me as a lead producer. There's so many feelings, excited, apprehensive. You know it's good, but there's nothing like hearing it's good from others. Janice Chan, in one of the episodes, she and I talked about developing the world of the play. And that is so true on opening night when it all comes together. And of course, this is after tech rehearsals that can run for such a long period of time. It was really special to watch that opening night happen. Now, friends, a cautionary tale. You can plan out things as well as you want to plan. Allison Hernandez talks about all the details, and you still can't prevent things from happening. Our opening night was delayed. We had a COVID outbreak case in the cast. And I just want to pause here to talk about or mention in both the podcast conversation with Eric Imani and Janice Chan, they talked about wellness. They talked about taking care of your physical and spiritual being. And I just couldn't emphasize that more. Now, we can't sometimes prevent COVID from happening, but what an important reminder to take care of our beings and everything that we do. And I would say that goes as a producer too. I'm now coming off of this part of the marathon, this show cycle of the marathon. And it's an important time to take time to celebrate, to reflect on what we were doing before we jump into it again. That rest, I sometimes say it's like the yeast in the bread, the leaven, like it just giving time for the bread to rise. You can't rush that, nor should we. And this is why it takes so long. And to the investors that are listening, this is key. It's part of letting the show breathe, letting it develop or percolate in our minds. It is almost as important as watching the run of a show, doing 8 shows a week. Equally important is watching the show come to be in the beings that are writing it and the actors that are performing it and the designers that are designing it. It's really so important. Word of mouth, as you know, is one of the strongest ways to sell tickets. I was grateful for all the reviews that you've heard me read and the strong word of mouth. The audience's response was really important too. Metro Theater Company's marketing team came up with this idea of fish cutouts, like cutouts of like just construction paper, cutouts of fish. I think they had a die cut that produced, I don't know, however many fish. And they allowed audience to write their responses and put them in a fishbowl. And that became really fun. We had fishes with different thoughts on this, why I like this show, what I want to see in the show. It also encouraged audiences to engage. Metro printed up a large, not technically a step and repeat, but more like a large poster. And that stood in the lobby. And we were able to have dress up props. There was pirate, mermaid, princess costumes, and that was really terrific. And then we encouraged people to post it on social media. So again, using everything to your advantage in your show and whatever stage it in is a great strategy. If you're watching my screen, you're going to see some of these first production photos. Can we talk about the importance of telescoping your show to the world? Can we talk about the importance of strong scenic design, set design, lighting design, costume design? Again, we had Janice Chan speaking about the scenic design in a project. It's so important. The world gets to see your first look at a show. We had great designers with Peter and Marjorie Spack. Jason Lossie did our lighting design. Eric, our technical director, helped build the set. It was really a collaborative effort, as is this theater. As one of the most exciting parts of this to me is the collaborative nature. And then seeing the pictures. These production photos are by Jennifer A. Lynn from Metro Theater Company's marketing department. And Suddenly this piece that we had been working on for years was coming to life, and we were able to share it with the world. And people leaned in. They leaned into the photos, to the story, to the music. It really is a moment of celebration. And of course, I would encourage you to have terrific production photos and then share them far and wide. Metro, again, did a great job with their social media, being able to share on Instagram and TikTok elements of the show. And I will also talk about at this stage that Metro received a grant to capture the show as a live stream and then sell virtual tickets. It was part of the technology grant, which really was a lot about accessibility. People who may not be able to get to St. Louis, similar to what Jason Turchin was talking about with capturing shows on Broadway. If people can't get to New York, how do we involve them? How do we bridge that gap a little better? And also, how do we lean into how the next generation processes entertainment? It's so key. So I was really grateful that we had a streaming opportunity, and I'll talk a little bit more about that soon. So these are production photos, different elements of the show. As a producer, I knew once we had a going concern, once we had the concept up and running, that it was imperative that I got people to see it. I needed to get folks in the building as much as possible. While the streaming option was terrific, we also knew that being in there and breathing with the actors and seeing the lighting and smelling the set design, like, you can't duplicate that. So I worked really hard as a producer to get folks to see it. I actually went back to my Club 23 people who had donated and invited some of those folks to come and look at the show and give me their feedback. I also reached out to colleagues that I knew had strong technical design, producing skills, anyone that I thought could lend a perspective that would be helpful. I called a colleague that I really value their opinion. And I knew this person would tell me exactly what they thought and not hold any punches. And that's why I brought them in. I needed to hear that perspective. What I don't think I was prepared for was the process of receiving feedback. And that's something I want to shine a little light on, is just exercising that muscle of receiving feedback. I think this is one of the hardest parts, because people will be prescriptive. They want to tell you how to fix the problem. But what I'm more interested in is, what is the perceived problem? What are they not understanding? What's not working 100%? And I call it mining for gold, because there's a sifting process. I feel like I'm a miner in California in the gold rush days. And I've just got this pan that you scoop up and it's dirt, and I'm just sifting it through, and people are telling me this. And I'm just listening and working hard to listen and find those golden nuggets. And sometimes it doesn't come until it's the second, third, or fourth person who's saying something. And then I'm like, oh, I get it. I see what they're saying. We're all saying the same thing, and we can fix it by doing X, Y, and Z. But that process of receiving feedback was so key. That made me think of Abra Camino Collective, Vicky and Vanessa.
I think the secret sauce is to be honest with what you're doing and staying true to the thing you want to make.
I felt like there was no time more important to remember that advice than receiving feedback. Because everyone wants to tell you how to write the show, even if they've never picked up a pen and written in their life. Everyone wants to tell you what you could do here or there, which is really, I'm seeking this feedback. But the key is to stay honest with yourself and stay true to the thing that you want to make, and to sift through what people are telling you to find the gold nuggets. It is a process that I wasn't expecting, that I'm very grateful for, and that I will surely lean into moving forward. And I will be very liberal in who I ask to come see the show, because I've had, majority of it has all been very positive, but I've had folks that this one particular person that was very harsh, and I needed that too. So my message is the importance of feedback, how to seek it, and how to process it when you get it. I highly encourage you to find people you trust and bring them to the show. You need to hear from everyone. This is reviews from the Riverfront Times. They say the imaginative musical thoroughly addresses a bevy of emotions and experiences centered on fear, loss, grieving, acceptance, and regaining hope. The performance captures the emotional tone of the script and integrate wonderfully with director Julia Flood's staging, simple but fanciful choreographer by Tyler White, and musical director Deborah Wixapuma enveloping soundscape. They go on to say the entire show is lifted up by the inventive and often whimsical scenic design of Marjorie and Peter Spack. And then they say it's crafted with an eye to kindness and hope. The Enchanting Spells of the Sea proves a thoroughly engaging and uplifting new musical for family audiences. Even sometimes in the reviews, I feel like that's mining for gold. It helps me to see how the production is being perceived and received. Okay, we ran the show for almost 30 productions for 4 or 5 weekends, even with the COVID delay. We had our largest house was 375 students. We did educational shows during the day and we did public performances at night. It was an incredible run. I can't say enough of my gratitude to everyone who was involved in every part of it. It felt to me like we had 2 runs. So we had the run on stage and then we had the streaming run. And that went for another week after the show closed. I haven't gotten the official stats on the streaming, and you can bet when I get them, I'll share them with you. But I will tell you that we had the show streamed in New York, New Jersey, California, Utah, Washington, Idaho, Hawaii, and New Zealand. And those are just the ones that I personally knew of. The ability to stream shows is something we need to talk about. And that goes back to my friend, Jason Turchin, talking about live captures and how streaming is really looking at how his son and daughter view entertainment and how we access that opportunity around the world. It's really something that I think we need to be looking at and leaning into. I talked about bringing to the production people that would give me feedback. I also knew that this was the time to build the bridges to our New York team. So we brought to the show the casting director, our general manager, and our director. And graciously so, my attorney also came to see the production, which I was so grateful for. Thank you, Michael Cinder. What I learned is that as wonderful as this regional production is, that the regional market has a different objective. They have different goals. And what we were able to achieve in this part of their season, one of many, in this case, 50 seasons, is different than what we may want to achieve as a commercial producer in a New York setting. I realized that in some ways, with all the successes that we had, we still had to push the reset button, because the regional model is so different than the commercial New York model. And that involved different team members. Again, a different director, different general manager, different casting. I don't think I realized this going into it, like the importance of the reset. And I've seen examples of when a Broadway show takes their cast and their creative and goes out of town and then comes back. I've seen that. But for many of us, as we are trying to get our shows to that New York stage on the big, colorful way, we often start, or I would encourage folks to start with the resources that you have around them, which is oftentimes the regional theaters. My advice and perspective is recognize that all the good that will do, it will still require different kind of work when you get to New York. At least that was my experience. We're entering a next phase. So we've had early front money invested in getting the show up on a stage somewhere through a reading, just getting a proof of concept. Now we're into this development raise stage where we're looking for investors who've seen the proven concept and are excited about the next steps and will help us take it to the New York stages. So I just want to call out that in the raise, there's different times for different money and a different messaging, early front money and then developmental money. It's so exciting to be even talking about next stages. It's exciting to think about where the show can be, where we want it to be. I think about the sound business principles that so many people in the podcast talked about, Michael Cinder being one of them. I think about looking for the ways to engage new audiences like Jason Turchin talked about. I thought a lot about the vision of a different Broadway, like Miranda Go and Ananth talked about. I've processed a lot the importance of taking care of oneself, like Eric and Janice talked about. And almost without exception, without exception, each of the guests on the podcast talked about the love and wonder of the work that we do. And if I can leave on an encouraging note, it's that we are engaged in a wonderful work, that there's nothing like bringing a story to the stage. It's a collaborative nature. It involves so many people. It requires investors and a trust. I have a deep respect for the investors that have put their trust in me and in this project. I'm grateful for those examples from investors like Dr. Elizabeth Nelson, Jason, others that take their hard-earned money and know that theater and art can change lives. And it's terrific to be a part of that in the long process. There's more to come for Spells of the Sea. This is where we are today, a triumphant moment as we've come through our enhancement. Also a triumphant moment as we come through our first season of podcasting. I'm so grateful for each of the guests that were able to join me. We've already started working on the next round of next season, again, with the goal to help emerging producers and first-time investors to understand the journey of producing theater. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive into Spells of the Sea, the first show that I have been blessed to be lead producer of. And on behalf of the entire creative team, the authors, the dramaturgs, the directors, the marketing, our partners with Metro Theater Company, all of the people who came to see it in live, in person, and also streaming it, thank you. And for those who are carrying with us on the journey or who may want to join us along the journey, thank you. And we invite you to be a part of it. It's very exciting. Until next time, thank you for joining Broadway's Bit by Bit, Broadway's only podcast dedicated to the producer-investor relationship.